Okay, it's my honor to introduce our speaker tonight, Matt Hokanson. Matt has been a longtime volunteer with Citizens for Conservation and with the Cook County Forest Preserves, but he's also the owner of the company's called Woods to Wetlands, which helps helps individuals actually with their designing native plant gardens. He's a burn expert. If you have a permission to be able to do a prescribed burn, sometimes he'll help with prairies that way. But he helps improve property habitats. And it's not just advice. The groups in Chicago Living Quarters give advice, help you identify which plants. If you want, Matt will actually help you build your native plant gardens. Whatever you need, as long as it's native trees or the shrubs or forbs or grasses, the whole area. And many of you, I expect, have native plants already, but the focus tonight is on the design of native gardens. And we think it's particularly important in front yards, and particularly in areas, a homeowners association or in some neighborhoods where they get fussy about having native plants that look too tall or too weedy. And so there's lots of wonderful native plants that work well in a garden design rather than out in the open prairie. So any of the issues you have might have an area that's wet or shady, or whatever the issues are that you need help figuring out what would look good there and grow well there. So I'm going to turn it over to Matt, and you're in for a wonderful program. Thank you for coming. Matt.
Thank you, Peggy. I appreciate that introduction. As she mentioned, I'm the owner of Woods to Wetlands. Our primary focus is restoring and maintaining natural areas and native gardens, but we also perform a variety of other ecological services. I've been part of the Barrington volunteer community for about 15 years, so I have a deep passion for nature. And I believe in restoring the health of every piece of land, from the large scale landscapes like our forest preserves to that backyard garden, not much bigger than a postage stamp with only a handful of plants. So many of you may know the benefits of native plants. Some of you may be new to this, but I'm going to talk about designing a native plant garden, and I'm going to go over a few basics at first. So it might sound a little dry to some of you, but I think it's important to talk about some of these things. So most importantly is, why do we use native plants? Simply put, native plants have a huge environmental advantage over traditional non-native landscaping, because native plants have evolved to be part of our natural systems, revitalizing soil, recharging groundwater, and nourishing wildlife here in northeastern Illinois, among a host of other benefits. Native plants don't require fertilizer or really much watering once they're established. They act as natural pest controls and reduce the need for pesticides. Many of them are deer or rabbit resistance. Native plants are the foundation of life and provide quality food for wildlife like caterpillars and other pollinators, as well as shelter for birds and other wildlife. The first step to designing your native gardens is ensure you have a plan in place. Poor planning can lead to unhappy plants. This can be due to improper soil, moisture, or light requirements, or improperly spaced plants. Ultimately, unhappy plants make unhappy people, which will cost you time and money in the long run. So as you go about planning for your garden, one of the things you want to decide are some of the goals that you have in mind. Here's an example of a poorly planned garden. So of course, as with many things in life, the important thing to think about is location, location, location. Where are you putting this? Is it existing lawn? Is it maybe a wet area? What's your sunlight levels? You might need to know what your soil conditions are like. Are you maybe making a green roof? Think about some of your reasons why you're putting this native garden in. Are you looking for any environmental or ecological goals? Are you trying to transform that wet spot of your property to something more beneficial for the environment? Are you looking to attract pollinators? Maybe increase native habitat because you live near some forest preserve or natural area? And maybe you're trying to reduce water use on your property because you have an existing garden or some area that's making you use much more than you'd like to. Sometimes you just need a garden to block something on your property, such as just, I don't know, utility boxes, gas meters, and such. Maybe you've got some aesthetic reasons for why you're putting in this garden. Think about whether you want evergreen plants so they're green year round. Are you looking for color throughout the seasons? And where on your property are you looking to put this at? And some things to consider, that some things you might be aware of and some not, are to consider putting habitat spaces like water features such as bird baths, bee houses, bird homes and bird feeders, but also some areas of loose or bare soil and mulch, because they're great places for ground nesting bees and even where turtles like to lay their eggs. This is a great picture, an example of a leftover mulch pile from a project I did at my house in Streamwood, where it happened to a random turtle came along and laid an egg. But unfortunately, as we tried to keep it throughout summer, it didn't hatch. But we just never know when you create these little spaces what might come along. So it's good to encourage it. When in doubt, get inspired. Think about some other places in your area. Besides this presentation, do some homework and research some examples or photos of native garden designs others have completed, especially ones that you really like. There's a lot of resources online. Study your neighborhood. Consider what design elements would look good in your neighborhood. You maybe want to make sure it's continuity with what everyone else has. Sometimes you maybe want to stick out and be that native garden amongst the sea of turf lawns. Find some inspiration in nature or sacred places that you know, the Botanic Garden, Morton Arboretum, forest preserves, nature centers. Importantly, think about your budget. Review the time and money you have available for the installation as well as maintenance. The general rule of thumb is, of course, the larger the space, the larger your budget. Tied into budget is that piece I mentioned, maintenance. What can or are you willing to maintain now and in the future? Because of course, weed control may be needed until your native garden is well established. If you envision a large, intricate space filled with native plants and multiple features such as bird baths, walking paths, you can always plan to plant and build your garden in phases. Start small and you can always expand in the following years. Important is to know your space. You have to, of course, know what your garden site is like, whether you've envisioned an entire property overhaul to be executed in one go or several years, or a small space when you're ready. It can be helpful, but not necessary, to map out the shell of your garden space before you begin to work, to estimate its size and become familiar with its characteristics. You know, understanding the topography, how much sunlight you have, your moisture conditions are crucial for selecting the right plants that'll work for your space. You may have to watch your garden throughout the seasons, because seeing it in one snapshot might not give you quite an idea of what it's like as time goes on. It might be dry now, but it might stay wet through other months of the year. You know, these are some site characteristics to consider. Of course, topography, whether you've got something flat, a depressed area, or something on a slope. Is your sunlight levels sunny, shady, or somewhere in between? And think of maybe some of the risks that might happen to your garden as time goes on. Is it subject to foot traffic from people? Do you have pets? Is it exposed to predators like deer, rabbits, or geese? Are you near a roadside that might be exposed to salt? Things to definitely be aware of when you're selecting the plants that you're putting in your garden. And of course, one of the most important things is to understand what soil that you have. So most of our soils in Illinois are mineral soils comprised of different sized particles of sand, silt, and clay. So for better understanding of your soil texture you'll be working with, consider taking a sample of your soil and trying to figure out what you have. So One way of doing a simple test at home is called a thumb test. You can take a handful of moist soil and you squeeze it between your thumb and your forefinger, and it creates a ribbon maybe an inch apart. And so as you squeeze this ball of soil, this ribbon will start to grow, and you'll be able to tell, can this ribbon hold its shape or will it fall apart? So the longer this ribbon forms, of course, the more able it is to hold its structure, which means it's comprised mostly of clay. And if it can hardly hold together at all, you likely have quite a bit of sand, and you'll feel how gritty and textured that is. So it helps you get a very simple and very crude way of knowing what kind of soil you might have on your property. Also, understanding how well your soil drains is important too. One way you can test this is doing what's called an infiltration test. You can dig a hole about a foot wide and maybe a foot deep, fill it up twice just so it can saturate the soil surrounding the hole. And then you want to fill it up again a third time and see how long that hole takes to drain. If it drains quickly in say 10 minutes, you've got probably sandy or loamy soil that drains really well. If it takes over a day, your soil probably has lots of clay or an impermeable layer of minerals below the surface that blocks the water movement. If this is the case, your site will likely be suitable for a rain garden filled with wetland-loving plants. Because of course, you don't want to put a cactus in a wetland or a lily pad on a hill. And now really comes the fun part about the garden is designing it. Now that you understand what type of characteristics your site has, you can start getting into the fun part. Generally speaking, there's two types of gardens that you can work with. There's considered a formal or a naturalized garden. A formal garden is a garden with a clear structure, and in most cases, a symmetrical layout with meticulous lines. Formal gardens generally appear neat, well-ordered, and are under complete control of the gardener. The plants are often evenly distributed within their designated space. A naturalized garden, on the other hand, is the opposite idea, with softer lines, less rigid plantings, with bountiful flowing plants that seem to lean right up next to each other in a lush landscape. Naturalized gardens create a feeling of being in the open and wild areas that surround the region of the garden, and they can come in all shapes and sizes. Make sure you consider all the rules of composition, screening, and circulation when designing your garden. Don't just go by the rule of thumb that says you need to put a rain garden in a low spot 10 feet from your house. Pick a shape that works with the rest of your garden design. A rain garden doesn't necessarily need to be a specific shape to function properly, so feel free to be really creative. A rain garden doesn't have to be quite formal. It can be as wild as you like, so be creative with your plant selections. You can pick all of one species, and it's okay if it fits with your overall design, or you can pick a variety of plants. Your rain garden doesn't necessarily have to be separate from other plantings. You could make it a depression within an existing perennial bed or a shrub border. It all depends on your property and what space you have. And if your space is tight and you don't have room for a larger rain garden, you can put in multiple small ones for each of your downspouts of your house. Naturalized gardens are a lot easier than formal gardens and get just kind of crazy with them in a way. You don't have to stick to a structure per se. I prefer to space out grasses and sedges evenly in bunches, and then mix in smaller groupings of forbs, maybe 3 to 7 plants or so. The natives will move around on their own and they'll fill in gaps. The reason I like to use grasses as a component of the matrix in the garden is they're great at filling gaps. They have deep root structure, so they're good at keeping weeds out. They're great for making a garden low maintenance, and they help keep the structure of some of your flowering plants. Some of our flowering natives are kind of tall, and once they start blooming midsummer, they can fall over, and it's kind of easy to see them become unsightly when that happens. So the grasses make a good support system for that. Here's a few examples of some naturalized gardens kind of in their early stages. And then, a formal garden is something that, is a lot more rigid. You can go see and use a lot of templates that are available online. Here's an example of one that you can use that has some native plants already picked and helps you kind of take the guesswork out of it if it's something that seems a little intimidating for you. One important thing to know about when you're planting in a formal garden is that these are native plants and they will move around on their own. So you have to consider how those plants move. Do they move via their root systems? Do they reproduce via seed? Some of our plants have seed that is wind blown, so they can end up moving around quite a bit. So you have to take that quite a bit into consideration when you want to plant a formal garden, so you don't have things going beyond what you envisioned, and then you end up having to tear out some of the natives as they start to naturalize themselves. There's some really nice tips to consider when you're building a formal garden. You can build something alone and isolated, like an island bed, or you can have something, a border garden that goes up next to your house or a fence. So in a border garden, you want to ideally put like the taller plants towards the back and the shorter, bushier plants up front. In an island bed, it's good to put some of those taller plants toward the center or to one side, and then have the shorter plants towards the edges, so that your taller plants aren't falling over into, say, your path or lawn per se. Think about the layers height-wise in a garden. So we're talking about kind of perennial plants for the most part, but also consider shrubs and shade canopy giving trees. So it gives you a whole different depth and interest to the aesthetic appeal of a garden when you consider all of the different layers and ways you can work them into the design of your garden. When doing a formal garden versus a natural garden, you can the idea is to put them all in one large grouping, say 25 or 30 plants, all depends on the size garden you're doing, rather than planting out, as I mentioned earlier, distributing your grasses evenly and then putting your forbs in separate places. Because normally, say if we had 20 species of one forb, we might put them in 3 different locations, those groupings of 3 to 7 in a naturalized garden. Well, in a formal garden, you just kind of keep everything grouped together, and you have to envision what this is going to look like long term. It's good to create kind of a showpiece too when creating a formal garden. Think of putting something to the center or to the side of the garden that's going to be really attractive. Like in the top left corner is a red bud tree that blooms purple in spring. We have some taller or just really strikingly beautiful flowering plants that you can just pick that are contrasting to the rest of your garden, so they really give you some kind of centerpiece to show off. And then I'm gonna add some fun accents. Earlier I talked about bird baths and bird feeders, water features, but also consider, putting in benches, a footpath. You can get really, really creative with your garden with a lot of the things that you can add besides just plants. And part of creating and designing your garden bed is shaping it. So part of designing a garden bed can get a little intimidating about how big you want to make it or how you want it to look. Shaping a bed can be an art. The shape of your bed contributes to the overall appearance of your garden. You can shape beds to create a feeling, contribute to your privacy, or even lead people through your garden. When laying out a design concept for your existing or a brand new garden space, it's recommended that you take the time to walk around the entire bed and the surrounding area to ensure you're able to see it from every angle, including the street, because it's important to know how it will look from every vantage point. Plus, having an attractive garden bed in view of the surrounding streets could help boost your property and home value. And I like to consider, depending what you already have, is use existing lines, shapes, and curves. If you have square and sharp lines already on your property, use squares and rectangles for your garden beds. Or if you have other things with softer lines, consider using curves and different geometric shapes. These are some ideas of what it might look like when you have some border or island beds. Border beds are usually easier to visualize compared to island beds because you have a backdrop to work with. Island beds can be as small as a mailbox planting or quite a bit larger. Similar to border beds, the length and width should be somewhat proportional. If your island bed is longer, it shouldn't necessarily be wider, it should be narrow. When creating an island bed, they shouldn't be anchored by a backdrop. They're usually viewed from all sides. And here's some example of contours that you can use in your garden. You might not have the budget to put in a lot of the hardscaping right away, but it's good to consider that when designing your garden because I mentioned earlier about being able to do this in phases. And if you envision some grand design that one day you might be able to pull off, you don't want to be tearing out plants and having to move them around. So definitely take that into consideration when you're doing your initial garden design. You know, we all don't want to be redoing work that we've already done. Now that you have some inspiration, some garden goals, hopefully you've chosen the right garden space and you understand the characteristics of your space, the next step is to choose your plants. The big idea here is to design with the right plant in the right place. So you need to know what plants will thrive in the space that you've chosen. I prefer to say no to cultivars. Cultivars are developed for attractive characteristics such as striking flower colors, shorter, bushier forms, colored or variegated leaves, winter hardiness, improved disease resistance. These qualities make them easier to incorporate into a home garden design, particularly when space is limited. There have been many field trials on native cultivars that assess these improvements relative to the straight species and to different cultivars. Some cultivars originate as mutations that were discovered in the wild. Most cultivars, however, are the result of selective breeding by humans. Hybrids are the result of a genetic cross between two different species. A plant label will be given the genera and species in italics, as seen in the slide, the Echinacea purpurea. And if it's a cultivar, it's followed by another descriptive name in single quotes. Here it's shown as a cultivarus, but they're often given a very descriptive name over the reason why they were bred. So maybe the red flower color, or the length of bloom time, but they always have a funny little name at the end in quotations, knowing that that is a cultivar. And, you know, it's hybridized by the X in the name, the Echinacea X purpurea. That means it's been hybridized between two different plants. But understanding cultivars can help explain several things. In order to consistently grow the desired characteristics the plant's been bred for, a cultivar cannot be grown from seed. It's grown from a clone. So every cultivar is genetically identical to every other plant with the same name. Buying cultivars from your garden can reduce its genetic diversity and resiliency against disease and changing climate conditions. Also, another issue with native cultivars is their potential for reduced or limited attractiveness to pollinator species. Separate recent studies conducted by Dr. Doug Tallamy and Dr. Annie White have suggested that the more manipulated the cultivars became, the less attractive they became to pollinators. Some of the traits that humans find attractive in native cultivars, such as red leaves, double flowers, or an unusual color, may make the flower less attractive to pollinators, and furthermore may decrease the quality and accessibility of the nectar and pollen rewards. So therefore, if you're considering native cultivars for use in a pollinator garden, it's best for open pollinated seed grown plants with natural mutations that occurred in the wild. And those are the best choices. Cultivars that differ significantly in color and morphology from the native species should be used cautiously. So when you start looking into developing a plant list, you want to research native plants that are available in our area and try to figure out how they fit within your garden space. One of the great tools and websites I like to use is through Prairie Moon Nursery. They're out of Minnesota, and they have an extraordinarily extensive library of native plants and seeds. And you can filter what plants you're looking for based on sunlight, soil moisture, and they give you a lot of different characteristics about the plant, the height, the spread, what pests they might be resistant to. So this will help you figure out what plants you want. Of course, you have to figure out if these plants are available. So wherever you're choosing to purchase from, whether it's a local nursery or a native plant sale, this tool will help you to at least develop a plant list initially. So something to consider is how tall the plant will be at its maturity. You want to think about like these grasses, little and big blue stem are very indicative of their names. One can be 2 to 4 feet and the other one can get as high as 8 feet. You want to consider the width of the plant, and of course, however it'll spread. And so some of these will create small colonies and move around on their own. Some, again, grow via seed, so they can move around quite readily, but that can and be the whole purpose of creating a native garden, because you're trying to create a space that's low maintenance. Once you have your list of plants that'll do well in your special place, especially if your size of your space is small, narrow down your choices even further. Even if your list is small, resist the urge to choose plants that have a low chance of survival. You know, we all have that really special plant that we really love, but if it's not going to work in our space, it's just not worth trying to grow. Of course, your spacing when thinking about plants is really important. You know, even though these are native plants and they'll move around on their own, we don't want to put too many like large shrubs too close together because they're not going to get the space needed for the proper growth. You need to be able to decide how many plants you need for your garden space. It's really nice to use some online tools. I like to use one through one of our local nurseries called Midwest Ground Covers. They have what's called a plant calculator. What it allows you to do is enter in the dimensions of your garden space and how far apart you want the plant spaced, and it will tell you exactly how many plants you need for your garden space. So it's really, really helpful. And you want to start thinking about the plants and the reasons you want to choose different ones, whether you're considering a bloom time. You know, do you want these to bloom through spring, summer, and fall? Do you want them to have different appearance? Some of these flower heads have different shapes and textures. Some are daisy-like, some are spiky, others are flat topped with clusters of little flowers. And some have really nice seasonal interest. The stems and leaves of some of our native shrubs and herbaceous plants can turn an interesting color in fall and winter. Some of these plants hold onto their seed and provide a food source to birds during the winter months. The one picture on the bottom left of this slide shows one of our native forbs that's kind of a shrub-like. It's called a white wild indigo. And its leaves turn black come the dormant season, and it holds its place throughout the winter, and really it has a nice attractive appearance in kind of the dull dreariness of a winter. And once you start picking your plants, it's good to develop a plant list. You can use Excel to develop a spreadsheet. This way you can enter in your plants and even a few characteristics on your own. And it helps you understand maybe like where you have some gaps and missing pieces to your garden. One you can see here, I have listed the height of the plant, the spacing, plus obviously the color of the bloom, plus when it blooms. So it can have you understand, do I have too much of one color, not enough of another? Is there any gap during that bloom time where you're trying to fill in? So it can just help you visualize what your garden's going to look like in the long run. Some other considerations you want to think about are pest resistance. Some plants are resistant to garden eaters like rabbits and deer. It usually has to do with the biochemical makeup of the leaf, but don't worry if you see a few bites taken out of your garden plants, it means it's part of the local ecosystem. But at other times, depending on the species chosen, they can be very susceptible to predation by deer and rabbits. So you may want to consider placing a temporary cage around your plants, such as woodland flax, New Jersey tea, and young oak trees until they mature, especially if you're known to have those pests visiting your yard. You want to think about black walnuts because they produce a substance called juglans that prevents many plants from growing close to the tree. If you struggle to find plants that can grow next to your black walnut, try looking for species with this natural tolerance. Many of our native plants are fairly resistant to black walnuts, so that's very beneficial. And erosion control. A garden full of deep rooting perennials can help battle erosion even on the steepest of slopes. And now kind of the fun part, and what some of you might be here to find out is some of the recommendations that I like to use within native garden spaces. I kind of isolated these based on different growing conditions, whether dry or moist. Are these tall or short, or are you growing in a sunny or a shady place? So as you can see here, I'm talking about a dry, sunny garden, and if you want shorter plants. I mentioned when you're trying to grow a naturalized garden that you want to evenly space out grasses and sedges and then plant the forbs in between. Here's a really nice array of native grasses that I really like to use. Being a natural garden, you sometimes might want it to resemble a local prairie, and our prairies are comprised of a matrix of grasses with the forbs growing in between the grasses. And so one of the benefits I mentioned earlier is that they really fill in gaps and they help create a structure for other plants. There's a difference between grasses. There's two different types for the most part that you'll find are cool season and warm season grasses. Cool season grasses grow early, start growing in spring when the soil temperatures are cool, and they bloom in June. And an example of this is the June grass and our sedges and the top left side oats ground. And then our warm season grasses grow more as summer weans on, and then they bloom typically more in August and September. And those two examples on the top right, I gave little blue stem and prairie dropseed are both warm season. The little blue stem, as you can see, is really great because it gives a beautiful dormant color. Once it turns this in fall, it's this beautiful auburn color. It's wonderful in winter in a natural native garden. The prairie dropseed is something that's quite often used in your typical landscape. You might see it in some medians in shopping centers. It's really one of the best grasses to use. It has a beautiful bushy appearance. It has flowers that have a wonderful odor. Some attribute to smelling like buttered popcorn. And then a few other flowers that I like to use: prairie fox, foxglove beard tongue, Jacob's ladder. These are just some really beautiful plants. And some of the really nice things about our native plants is just their striking appearance. They have some really unique colors, some unique shapes and sizes. Many of you know about the plight of the monarch butterfly and how we kind of are promoting the planting of milkweeds. So milkweeds are the host plant to monarch butterflies. They lay their eggs on this plant. The caterpillars feed on it, and then the adults will turn to any plant for nectar and food as an adult. This being one of our only plants in the area that blooms orange, and it's kind of a bushier plant, has a really long bloom time. I really, really recommend it for almost any native garden that at least has some fairly well-drained soils. Next to it are the prairie clovers, white and purple prairie clover. They're kind of skinnier, wispier plants, but nonetheless very striking in appearance in a garden. The purple and orange color, if you combine the purple prairie clover and butterfly milkweed, are really a nice combination. Next to it, lead plant is actually a prairie shrub. It's something you can allow to grow for many, many years, or you can cut it to the ground or burn it, and it'll grow back every year. It has some really cool flowers, the purple and orange accents to it. Next to it is bottle gentian. Gentians, along with below that asters and goldenrods, are some of our later blooming species. They bloom in August, September, and October when a lot of other plants have gone dormant. So it gives good food for wildlife in that later part of the year. Gentians are really nice because they have the most beautiful purple colors in their family. This is one that you can buy at nurseries called bottle gentian. The flowers actually stay closed in that really unique shape that it has. And what's fun about it is the only pollinator that can feed on it are bumblebees. They actually have to force their way through the tip of that flower down in for the nectar. You can find videos of this online. It's really, really cool to see if you ever happen to actually see it in the wild. In the bottom left is wild petunia. Many of you are advocates of petunia plants. You can buy them at many local nurseries. Cultivars that are annuals. This is a perennial. It does spread rather well. It's a small plant, so maybe you want that in a garden, something that creates ground cover. But also you have to be aware of these plants that are rapid spreaders, because maybe that's something you don't want if you're going for a formal garden. Next to it is mountain mint. It's a nice plant because it has a beautiful, beautiful smell when it's flowering, and even more odorific once it goes dormant in fall, and its seeds are just wonderful to smell. And I mentioned those asters and goldenrods. They're always great plants for late season appearance. You'll see me have that in a number of slides because they're great for sunny, shady gardens, wet, dry. They're really great all around. They hold their structure through the winter dormant season. And so they're really good for certain wildlife that like to overwinter in the stems of plants. We have some insects that overwinter underground, some that overwinter as adults, some that burrow into the stems of plants to overwinter. So it's good to have these plants that are have a sort of a rigid structure that can be nesting places for insects to overwinter. But be cautious of asters and goldenrods because they do have seed that's wind blown. So depending on which species you choose, even if you're looking to have a naturalized garden, they'll move around possibly more than you would like them to. Maybe you're okay with some taller plants in your garden. These first couple grasses I listed are some components of our tall grass prairie that once comprised all of Illinois. Be aware that these can be aggressive. They're really nice for that dormant color, as you can see from the picture. And sometimes you like to have tall grasses to hide, say, like a utility box, an electrical box of some kind. But if it's isolated, that's okay, because you might want something that's aggressive like this. But if you're looking to have more of a naturalized garden, and especially a formal one, these are plants you want to avoid. So be aware of that when choosing your plants. It's good to look for people that might be used to these plants when helping to develop a plant list. If you're going to, let's say, buy your plants at a local native plant sale, there's a lot of people there that are very familiar with their plants and can help you with some of this selection. The blazing star or Liatris species are some of the most beautiful flowers in the prairie. Some of them are even included in floral arrangements you can buy at flower shops. I like the next one, rattlesnake master. When you're thinking about native plants in a native garden, you're trying to kind of think uniquely, and this just has one of the most unique names. It has a unique foliage, it's cool flowers, really cool seeds. It's just a unique plant all around that I like to recommend. The white wild indigo on the bottom left is kind of a bushier form, and it's great. It's the one I showed earlier in its winter form that its leaves kind of turn black in that shape through winter. These silphiums, they look similar to sunflowers. They're some of our most tallest plants in the wild that grow around here. 4 of them we have: cut plant, compass plant, prairie dock, and rosinweed. They're really great if you're looking for that tall centerpiece plant in your garden. These plants are really cool. They have such long root systems And they're just something worthy of having in any native garden if you have the space for it, because they are rather large. And again, asters and goldenrods. Kind of thinking about more of a rain garden. This is in a sunny area with short plants. The arrowhead is more of almost an aquatic plant, but it's really unique in appearance. Blue flag iris. It's again one of the most striking of flowers it can be in your rain garden. It's an early bloomer. It grows small little colonies because it spreads via roots. Marsh marigold is probably the earliest plant you can find to grow in your garden. It grows actually well in sunny and shady rain gardens. I mentioned mountain mint earlier. This can also grow in drier and moister places. Monkey flower is just a really cool wetland plant that does very, very well in a lot of situations, especially if you're dealing with different pollutants in the stormwater, or if you have maybe a roadside ditch of some kind. These spike rushes, also known as Eleocharis, if you don't like really a tall, maybe flowering garden that you want in maybe a wet spot, some people just like their lawn appearance, and you have that wet spot in your yard that doesn't really grow turf grass very well. This is a great plant that grows these colonies. As you can see, it's not much more than maybe 6 to 12 inches tall, and from a distance might look like grass, but it's just a really cool wetland plant. Lobelias are just some of the, again, most striking flowers in our area. I really recommend the great blue lobelia, and eventually you'll see cardinal flower in another slide for any rain garden. And then I say sedges because they comprise almost all of our wetlands in our natural areas, what we would call sedge meadows. And sedges are just great for holding that, for fighting against weeds, just like grasses are. And I just think they're one of the most important components of any garden. There's the cardinal flower I mentioned. It's really, really striking. It's attracted hummingbirds. And you can see it from a mile away if you've ever seen this in the wild. Culver's root is another cool plant that is just packed with pollinators during its height of its bloom. Some other cool ones, like these pink ones, ironweed, Joe Pyeweed, are kind of tall and are really fun in appearance. Joe Pyeweed actually has a vanilla smell to it. The swamp milkweed down in the left corner is a milkweed that can grow well in wetland areas. And I also mentioned that vanilla smell on Joe Pyeweed. This one smells like candy. I think it has one of the best smells of any of our native plants in the area. So if you ever come across this swamp milkweed, I highly, highly recommend going up and giving it a sniff. Many of you are aware and heard of black-eyed Susans. Many of them are actually annuals or biennials. A lot of them grow in drier, sunnier prairies. This is one that can grow in savannas and even wetland areas. It's called sweet black-eyed Susan, but important to have because it's a perennial. It's not annual or biennial, so this will stick around for many, many years. Turtle head is just one of the most unique flowers we have in our area, as you can see just by the shape of those flowers. I just highly recommend it. And then in the bottom right is a hard or a soft stem bulrush. There's many bulrush species. If you've got a larger wet space and you have the space to accommodate some larger plants, bulrushes are kind of like a larger version of sedges or grasses, and they're really cool. Now more of your shadier garden. On the drier side, I'm going to mention sedges over and over again. This is one that I really like to use in shady gardens. It's almost like the drop seed of the woods is this Carex rosea. Jack in the Pulpit is one of the most unique flowers you'll ever find in the wild, so it's just cool to have. The ones on the right hand of the part of the slide that are bordered in red are kind of plants that create almost a ground cover. So growing in a shady area, it's not as easy to get plants to establish as maybe a full sun garden. So if you have difficulty getting plants to establish, these are ones that create almost little colonies or create more of like a ground cover effect. So as you can see from the picture of Mayapple, on the left side, the flower is white and is actually underneath the foliage. The picture on the right half of it is actually it in its little colony. They're maybe no more than 8 inches tall, and they create these little umbrellas. It's very, very interesting. To the left of those is the Solomon seal and nodding wild onion. Again, just some great plants that are easy to establish in a shady garden space. Here's some really beautiful and unique ones that are worth using. Virginia bluebells is something many people might be aware of, and you see on the roadsides in spring, because it can actually grow in some fairly degraded areas that have been taken over by buckthorn and some other shadier trees. Because early in spring, the canopy of the trees has not really shaded out the areas yet. So Virginia bluebells comes along and really colonizes well. I've seen some people plant it side by side with this celandine poppy, and it just creates a really cool effect with that combination of blue and orange. The celandine poppy stays around through summer while the Virginia bluebells goes dormant. Even though the flowers wither away, these are called ephemeral plants, so they're short-lived. Some plants, the foliage sticks around throughout summer. Some of these plants go completely dormant, so it's good to consider that when picking plants. It's not, that information is not exactly widely available like on Prairie Moon Nursery, so it's good to find somebody who has experience with these plants if you are concerned about that. Because Virginia bluebells, when you plant it, it'll be bare soil by midsummer. And when you plant something like Wild Dream on the right side of the slide, its foliage is there all the way through fall. Trilliums are really some of the coolest plants in our woodlands. They get their name from the 3 leaves, the 3 petals, and the 3 sepals that grow on there. So they grow in threes, given the name tri in trillium. But these are just really, really cool. Be careful, they're very susceptible to deer predation. And I mentioned goldenrods and asters. This is a cool one that works well in woodlands called a short aster. And as I mentioned about spring ephemerals when talking about shade-loving plants, in our natural areas in northeastern Illinois, most of our woodlands are comprised of oak and hickory trees. Oaks are some of the last trees in our area to leaf out. So that gives the woodland area the maximum amount of time in spring for sunlight to penetrate the tree canopy. So a lot of these plants can grow, the spring-loving plants, to flower, make seed, and reproduce. But then as summer goes on, the trees grow in their leaves, their canopy, the shade increases. And so generally speaking, the plants that start growing throughout the year get taller in size. So it's kind of hard to recommend to people certain plants in a shady garden when they are saying, oh, well, I don't like tall plants, I really want rather short ones. Well, then a lot of them are really going to grow more in spring than in summer. So all these pictures I show on this slide, these taller plants are generally more summer blooming plants or fall blooming plants. So that is something to consider when you have a shadier garden. I like this pale Indian plantain, is just a cool plant. The Joe Pyeweed is another one I mentioned earlier that is a wetland plant. This one is one that grows in the shade. Hyssop, it's a mint plant, so it's just really rather cool. Sedges, as I'll be a sedge advocate over and over again, this is a one that has a very, very unique flower heads, this long beaked sedge. Down in the bottom left is bottlebrush grass. We have a variety of rye grasses that grow in the area that are great at establishing in bare soil areas. This is just one of the more unique ones called bottlebrush grass. And then some of the other nice plants, goldenrods, asters, and this black cohosh. And then you can think about when you get into more of a moister, shady garden. Some of these plants are going to overlap from previous slides because, of course, these native plants grow well, and some grow well in a variety of conditions. This first one, Bloodroot, is really cool. It's an earlier bloomer. It goes dormant rather quickly, but I just think it's one of the most beautiful plants you'll see in the wild. And its seeds are actually carried around the woodland by ants. Ferns are something to consider when you get into a moist, shady garden. Some are really fun in appearance, some are small, some are dainty, some are large, and some can be aggressive. So be aware if you're ever considering putting in ferns. The one called ostrich fern is very aggressive, and you may regret planting it if it isn't something you wanted to establish. This burr sedge, Carex grayi, is a really cool one. The meadow anemone, beautiful white flowers. This creates a nice little carpet, and grows in little colonies. Jack in the pulpit I talked about earlier. Wild hyacinth is another really beautiful plant in spring that's able to colonize very easily. Woodland phlox is just of any plants. I like to recommend phlox if you can get them, but they're easily predated on, and sometimes they're not readily available from nurseries. And March marigold too in this garden. Here's again some overlaps from previous slides. This tall bellwether is one that's really cool to have if you're okay with taller plants, but it is an annual. So it's a plant that most often isn't sold via plug. You can find it sold via seed. So that might be an economical way of establishing certain plants in your garden, depending what you're looking to put in there. And then you'll see some of the other plants I've talked about before. Cardinal flower, you can just never get away from using that wherever you can. The rye species, Indian plantain, and of course, asters and goldenrods. And so as you start choosing those plants that you like for your garden, and I mentioned certain ones that are worth consideration to either avoid or at least caution. If you want a formal garden, I would highly recommend avoiding a lot of these plants. So like the brown-eyed Susan, I mentioned sweet black-eyed Susan earlier. This brown-eyed Susan is a biennial, so it lives its life on reproducing via seed. And it reproduces very heavily, and soon, very quickly, your garden can get overwhelmed with this plant, or it can be working its way into cracks and crevices of places you never really intended. Plants like the gray-headed coneflower, sneezeweed, woodland sunflower are kind of pioneer plants in a prairie, wetland, or a woodland restoration. I call them pioneer plants because they come along really early in a restoration. They seed very easily, they reproduce easily, and they colonize, which is a good thing when you're trying to restore a large-scale natural area. But when you're trying to create a small garden space, they can suddenly become a little too aggressive. The swamp rose mallow is something that it's a cool wetland plant. The issue with it is it's very big and tall. It has gigantic leaves and it seeds really easily. So as it starts to reproduce, it creates these colonies that almost form a little mini forest. And it basically shades out and kills off everything else you've planted in the area due to shade death. So it slowly just takes over an area. Virgin's bower is a native vine. Sometimes you might pick a vine for a particular purpose that you might find useful. Vines can be rather cool, but this being a native one that spreads via seed from the wind, suddenly where you planted it, it will be found everywhere on your property, climbing in and around the trees you didn't intend it to, the shrubs you didn't want it to, and you'll be cursing the day you ever put that on your property. And I did mention that asters and goldenrods also spread via the wind, their seed. So you have to be cautious about which ones you choose for which space. Some are more aggressive than others. Some you want to avoid completely outright. But maybe something aggressive is something you really want. If you've got a wet area on your property that might be inundated with reed canary grass, maybe you're close to a creek, a wetland, or a natural area, and you kind of want to reclaim that area that's infested with weeds, or maybe you're worried about it at some point in time, Reed canary grass is one example of a few different wetland invasives that are aggressive through their root systems. Another is cattails, the other is Phragmites. They spread through rhizomes, create massive monocultures. And as in normal natural areas, when we're trying to establish native plants and we're trying to get rid of the bad ones, over time, we're establishing these good native plants in, and then trying to keep out the bad ones until everything is naturalized and looks healthy. So as we establish native plants, we have to do weed control year after year. But these rhizomatous plants are particularly pernicious in the fact that they grow via their roots. So the best way to combat a rhizomatous invasive is via rhizomatous natives. So this is a wonderful list of what some people might call wetland warriors. These burreed, sweet flag, cordgrass, bulrushes, and then a whole host of rhizomatous sedges. So as I mentioned, aggressive plants may be sometimes what you're looking for. We're all keen to seeing sometimes we have to get rid of that hedge of buckthorn that might be giving us good privacy. Now, I know we all really enjoy our privacy, but at the same time, we may or may not like buckthorn. So as you get rid of it and you're trying to keep that privacy, it's good to plant some native shrubs in its place that also give that structure and appearance that will also keep privacy. These are some deciduous shrubs that I like to recommend that are native to our area for replacing buckthorn and use as a privacy screening. There are also arborvitaes and some native evergreens that are good to use. These are just the deciduous ones that I like to recommend. I'll just give people a moment to continue notes or taking a picture if you need to. And this is my small list of recommended shade trees when creating a garden. There's a variety of these that are very good growing in a lot of different conditions, and especially the oaks. They're almost a keystone species. They are a host to a significant variety of caterpillars. So especially if you like birds and other wildlife, they're really, really good to have on your property. I mentioned the name earlier, Doug Tallamy. He's a huge promoter of oaks and talks a lot about those benefits of those caterpillars and the ways they actually can impact wildlife in your area in a huge way. So when there's a big roadblock a lot of times in the past to trying to get native plants, that's not so much the case these days. There's a lot of nurseries that grow and supply native plants. Some of them are able to supply wholesale to other nurseries, because one I don't have listed on here is Midwest Ground Covers, because they're not open to the public, but they do offer their plugs wholesale or plant material wholesale through other nurseries in the region. But this is just a small list of places that are open to the public and you can source some of your native plants from. Another great resource, of course, is local native plant sales that are hosted by a lot of non-for-profits. Lake County Forest Preserves holds one every year. A couple of chapters of Wild Ones does, Citizens for Conservation, the Schaumburg Area Garden Club. So really, it's a great place to shop for plants and also pick the brains of people that have a lot of experience with these plants. So as you design your garden space and of course are now in kind of execution phase, you can think about preparing your garden space, and many of you may already be aware of how to do this, but I'm just going to scroll through a few slides of some examples of things my wife and I did on our property. Of course, the first thing you're going to do is kind of shape your garden. And we first laid this out with pin flags so you can move them around. And then when we wanted to use a method called sheet mulching to establish our garden bed, we put this cardboard down, spray painted the outline, we put the mulch down, and then cut the excess material off from around the edges. You're going to want to remove the existing vegetation in a number of ways, whether it's manual, with sod cutting. Some people use solarization. with tarps. There's a lot of information online I would recommend looking into versus using clear plastic or black plastic. They can have good effects on trying to kill off things, but they can have detrimental effects to things that are good, like soil microbiology. Or even if you use these over existing trees, you're smothering the trees from getting the proper oxygen and moisture that they need. I am a fan of using what's, I mentioned this sheet mulching method, is just laying down a layer of cardboard or 6 layers of newspaper, and then putting 2 to 3 inches of mulch over it. In about 4 weeks, the grass is dead, most of the cardboard is broken down, and it's completely ready for planting. So you can see kind of the various stages of doing this. So, there's a lot of controversy and discussions over mulching, not mulching. I say if you're ever putting in trees and shrubs, mulch is always a really good thing. When you're establishing a perennial native garden, it can work both in your favor and against you in a variety of ways. So mulch is good for regulating soil moisture, keeping down weeds. And the thing is with that, with native plants, is they like having their the soil, they grow really best in warm conditions. I mentioned earlier some of the warm season grasses like prairie dropseed. I've seen them actually take a long time to really grow to their full maturity when covered and smothered by mulch, because it's keeping the soil moisture down, which can be a good thing in certain instances. But when you're trying to establish this native garden, you want your plants to grow to their maturity as fast as possible. It can be beneficial just to leave it to open soil and allow your to get as much sunlight as possible. So it's just a lot of considerations to take into fact when you're deciding to put in a garden. But more often than not, mulch is a good idea, especially when you're trying to keep down weeds. Here's some examples of turning our backyard into a rain garden. We used a sod cutter, cut it up, created a depression, and then added some really slide to come along. Sorry, it's taking a moment. We added these features of like this dry creek bed that comes down from our one downspout and feeds into the rain garden. On the other side, we had some underground piping that led to it. And then within a matter of a couple of years, we had this beautiful garden with a whole variety of different plants, and in my mind, much better than just your ordinary turf grass. This was a small rain garden just in the front of our house. The previous owner had an affinity to the southwestern theme, so he had this saguaro cactus shaped arborvitae that I decided would be much better as a rain garden. So with that, that is kind of my spiel on not only thinking about what you need to know about your property, how you pick your native plants, how you go about establishing them. I really enjoy doing this. I could go on and on for a really long time talking about this. It's kind of hard to squeeze in a presentation like this into a short amount of time. Of course, there's hundreds of native plants that grow around here, and it's hard to just pick a small amount to showcase. So here's my information. If any of you have any further questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me with anything about native plants, because a huge part about restoration and trying to heal the environment, a big component is education, because of course we all are learning this ourselves, but we're trying to teach the younger generation. We're trying to teach our neighbors what the right thing is to do. So I'm always happy to teach people about this. So yes, please don't hesitate for any questions to reach out to me.